Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. Hope everyone's having a great conference. Thank you very much for being here at this session on registry infrastructure. My name is Robin Ricks, President of the Climate Action Reserve, and I have the honor of moderating this session. Can you all hear me okay? Great, okay. Joining me on stage today are four eminent panelists. I'd like to just sort of briefly welcome each of them and from my left on to the end, Chris Canavan, CEO of the Global Carbon Market Utility, Katie Doyle, Senior Vice President, Registry Solutions with Expansive, Will Graham, Manager, Environmental Markets at the Intercontinental Exchange, and Arslan Saeed in Business Development, Americas at S&P Global. We're thrilled to have a moment here to share some ideas and to listen to the panelists today. I want to open just by offering a very brief remarks about the importance of this topic and why it's on the conference agenda this year. In my sense is that environmental markets really sit at a pretty fascinating intersection between two groups, environmentalists and financiers, who probably traditionally haven't really met in the wild very often. Skill sets, areas of expertise, and maybe even worldviews can sometimes be radically different, and the Venn diagram might just be two circles. So I might even be so bold as to say that the two groups have even maybe historically regarded each other with some skepticism. And environmentalists might regard the other as people looking to make a buck off the back of the environment, and vice versa. The money people might regard the environmentalists as perhaps more sandals and candles and less concerned than they should be about such quotidian matters as KYC, encumbrances, security interests, and SOC 2 compliance and the like. But the reality is that the sector does need both, and the stakes for getting it right are pretty important, if not existential. And in my view, at least, registry infrastructure sits pretty squarely at the intersection between these two. And I think it's that sort of dynamism which makes this topic as interesting as it is. So, without further ado, got a couple of sort of topics I'd like to lead off with the panel, and sort of just maybe question number one is, let's work backwards. The year is 2031, and we're gathered here today to talk about the successful evolution of carbon market registry infrastructure over the past 5 years. Question for the panel: what decisions and what design choices were made that contributed to this success? Chris.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for inviting me to participate along with these eminent panelists, co-panelists, and also thanks for previewing that question so that I could think about it a little bit. I think it's, if we are looking back from 5 years from now and marveling at our success, it's important to define success. And I think that we're all here in order for what we do to have climate impact, to register in the climate. And that means that this market really needs to be scaled up in a way that isn't a multiple of its size, but really an order of magnitude larger than it is today. And if you imagine a market that is an order of magnitude larger, $50 billion, let's say, a year, then you see a market that has many more sellers, many more projects, many more buyers, and many more reasons for buying. And that is a complex market which needs a sophisticated matching function to be able to match supply and demand. And we know from other markets that in order for that matching to happen in an effective and efficient way, you need adequate infrastructure. So if we're 5 years from now looking back, we are, and celebrating success, we're proud of the infrastructure that we have built. But I think it's worth asking, what does that infrastructure look like? And again, if you look at other markets, then I would say we would be celebrating the fact that we built 2 layers of infrastructure: a commercial layer of infrastructure with infrastructure providers that are commercial entities. This panel is a very good cross-section of those commercial providers. And then a kind of foundational layer of infrastructure that in other markets operates essentially as a public good. So, for example, we've got the Intercontinental Exchange. We can't really use shorthand anymore because that confuses people. So we're going to have to spell it out. Whose pride and joy is the New York Stock Exchange. They own the New York Stock Exchange, which obviously is a critically important piece of commercial infrastructure in the securities market. But the New York Stock Exchange couldn't really exist without a foundational layer that is mostly made up of an entity called the Depository Trust Corporation, the DTCC, which most people have never heard of, but without which there would be no securities market that we know today, and we wouldn't have the New York Stock Exchange doing the brisk business that it does. I suppose I could say the same about S&P, which is effectively a data analytics company, which is in fact a preeminent data analytics company, which wouldn't be able to do the work that it does if it didn't have data readily available, clear and concise, so that they could crunch the numbers and turn that into ratings or turn that into pricing reports or all sorts of other analytics. Expansive has perhaps the dominant presence in the REX market, for example. That market benefits from the fact that there's a clear regulatory layer. There are simple methodologies, simple measurement techniques, and all of this kind of soft infrastructure, which is like oxygen. It's hard to see, but if it didn't exist, then these commercial providers wouldn't really be able to operate at the scale they operate. So we need that foundational layer. In the market today, I think we've got the commercial layer more or less covered, and I think that this panel, me, is a good representation of that. But the foundational layer needs a lot of work. And so again, if we're celebrating 5 years from now, it's because I think we've built that foundational layer. We've built a layer of infrastructure that is that's delivering a public good. It's independent of commercial activities, and so that no one calls into question whether there are conflicts of interest. It's neutral, it's inclusive, it's meant to expand and deepen the market. It's robust enough to be regulated. It's got all of these characteristics that we see in other markets, and that, I think, is what we would be celebrating 5 years from now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And that was a very, I think, comprehensive answer, and I think sort of provides a lot of sort of food for thought. Will, did you have something you wanted to sort of share on this, given the Intercontinental Exchange's own role?
Yeah, and you'll have to excuse me because I'm definitely going to say ICE. I can't help myself. So yeah, but yeah, thank you for being here. Very excited. I think Chris builds on a really interesting narrative of thinking about where do we want the market to be. And I'd like to expand on that a little bit. I totally agree with the way that he's thinking about it. But I think it's what may be useful as an anchor point is to compare an existing market. And given that we're in California, we can look at the California Cap and Invest. And under California Cap and Invest, polluters have explicit financial risk with their carbon emissions, and they need to manage this financial risk through pricing and transfer of risk, and they do that through liquid markets. So to give an idea of the scale in California in 2025, maybe this is something that the carbon credit market can aspire to. I think there were about 270 million allowances available through auctions and whatnot last year, but the market used to hedge and transfer that risk was many times larger. It was 4 billion allowances traded on ICE alone. And so that's energy suppliers, global banks, and even third-party technology platforms all coming together to build this sort of rich market ecosystem. And they're doing it, as Chris was saying, on trusted infrastructure. So what does the carbon credit market need to adopt to be able to facilitate that? I think there are sort of two main layers. The first is upstream of issuance. The workflow needs to be fully digitized. We need to be able to remove all of the frictions that go up to issuance, and hopefully that reduces errors, but also allows for credits to be rateable, insurable, and assured. The other sort of layer that I want to talk about is the core registry infrastructure, and I think that Chris touched on this as well. But for capital to flow into the market, it has to sit on trusted infrastructure. And so I think one of the things that we would like to see on the infrastructure level are technology providers with tier 1 cybersecurity standards, deep balance sheets, and experience running institutional infrastructure. Because ultimately, institutional investors aren't going to put money into markets that they don't trust the infrastructure of. So to sum that up, it's the digitization of the workflow, speed up issuance and minimize errors, and then having that trusted infrastructure to allow capital to flow.
Thank you. Arsalan, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's really echoing Chris and Will's points there. I mean, I think the way that the market is moving, in 5 years from now, the registry providers that will continue to be around are the ones that, they didn't just build siloed data repositories. They really built infrastructure that's ready for the markets to scale. And we've seen the way that the market is going with convergence between voluntary and compliance systems. So, for example, at S&P, we built and operate the National Registry for Singapore. And I was chatting with Chris right before this, but in terms of what they've done with the percentage of the carbon tax being able to be met by offsets, what that infrastructure is able to do is it's able to make sure that systems from the voluntary market can work with compliance markets, right? And then I think, building API-first infrastructure, able to avoid that fragmentation. And like you said, Will, we really have to move from a place, even pre-issuance, of making sure that data is machine readable. You have registries in place with as real-time data as possible. So not only does that mean in terms of retirement data, giving buyers confidence, but then also from a project developer standpoint, you're able to kind of transparently see where you exist, what do timelines look like from registration to issuance, et cetera. And I think those will be the systems that can do that will be the ones that will be around in the next 5 years. So.
Okay. Last but not least, right? Saving the best for last year. So, I echo what the full panel is saying on all the points around how to advance the technology here. But personally, if I was to look at 2031 and envision the success of the next era of registry infrastructure, I think it would be because we resisted the temptation to really overload or to break apart registries. Registries are a distinct layer in the ecosystem, and it's going to take the full ecosystem and other components to continue to scale this market. And so having registries continue to do what they do best, which I'd say, is authoritative project records, issuing instruments, and obviously then tracking the transfer and retirement of said instruments, while having, again, that broader ecosystem around it, innovating and through clean and intentional connections, feeding back into the registries.
Thank you all. I want to just actually pick up on a point which I think all of you alluded to, and I checked there was some consensus over some principles, but maybe just drilling down a bit and just teasing out whether actually there may be some differences of views, and just to let people in a little bit on sort of the reserves own thinking here. First generation registry infrastructure was very much built around the concept that there was a sort of a single registry that would sort of do everything for a program. It would be the warehouse, the repository of all the project-related information and the records, which you can go on to and search, and it would also be the tracker or the register of the credits that get issued, sort of from the point of issuance all the way through to ultimate consumption or retirement cancellation or holding, as the case may be. But I think a live question that we often think about internally, and be very keen to sort of hear what the panel thinks is whether or not these are two roles or one, and whether sort of a single piece of infrastructure can be and should play the part of both, or are these sort of separable concepts, and if so, what does that sort of look like structurally? I'd be very sort of curious to get the panel's thoughts on that, and maybe Katie, would you want to?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Robin. No, it's a very interesting question. I think, the architectural model that the market uses today for registries, in my view, already works and scales. I think the mistake would be trying to overload registries with adjacent functions such as digital MRV, trading, real-time analytics. And that's because the next era of registries succeeds when they remain focused, and as I said before, the ecosystem around them innovates, right? So, for decades, registries have reliably performed, I'd say, three major functions, right? It's the project records, again, it's issuing the credits, and then it's tracking and retiring those credits. And so the question for the next era shouldn't be whether registries abandon these functions. In my opinion, they shouldn't. Project data, issuance, transfers, retirements, they belong together, and they belong in registries. I think the real question is what's changed. And the ecosystem around registries is and has to change, right? As the market scales, there's the increasing demand for new capabilities like digital MRV or real-time trading venues or custodial and settlement solutions. And so these are very, very important capabilities, but they're not necessarily core registry functions. And so, trying to absorb all of that into a single architectural layer risks weakening the market and weakening registries all around, what they're supposed to provide, which is that stable, neutral, authoritative system of record for asset lifecycle.
Yeah. And yeah, definitely not to disagree with your points, Katie, but even taking a different look at things, I think I like this question because I think it forces us to think about the way that we want the market to evolve and not necessarily the way that the market exists now, right? So I think, where you have this concept where registry was before, sort of the end-all be-all in terms of where project information was also stored, we're seeing a little bit of specialization happening, not only in terms of the standards that we work with, but then sort of when you look at the market abroad. And I really think that's a case of everyone kind of playing to their own strengths. So I think as a standard, the relationship that you have with the methodology and obviously the project developers is specializing in its own system, whereas when you're looking at the registry, you're able to focus on things like exploring the concepts of legal title and security interest, and how do we get the market to that next level where you have financial institutions coming in and providing that capital, right? I think two systems is fine. It works because you have that specialization, and I think we have the interoperability kind of there already as well, to where you have that seamless flow of data. Even if two systems exist, as long as they can kind of speak to one another and reflect in real time the realities of the two systems, I think that's a solution that works as well. So yeah, I mean, the way that it's being done now it works, but we have to think about sort of how we want the market to look in the future, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think this may be a bridge between the two. I mean, I'll just say ICE Green Trace views the workflow up to issuance, which maybe you would call like a life cycle, but probably not. But the workflow up to issuance and then the core registry technology is fundamentally different. So the core registry technology, like Katie was saying, is transfers and retirement and audit trail. And then the workflow is like all the pieces of the rich ecosystem that could be third-party tools accessing or like say project registration, VBBs, they're accessing the data through APIs or through a digital interface, basically taking the data that they need, processing and putting it back in. And I think a key thing for us is it's important to be able to facilitate like the wider ecosystem to be able to access that seamlessly. But we view these as separate modules, and in ICE Green Trace, just to drive this home, like an issuing body that contracts with ICE Green Trace can elect to contract for just the core registry technology or both the workflow technology and the core registry technology. And we're with our Go Live partner, Environmental Resources Trust, they decided to take both, but that's not necessarily prescriptive.
Last and least, now that everything's been said, my guess is that, although I don't know most of you in this room, that many, if not most of you, at one time or another, have complained about fragmentation in this market, and that fragmentation exists along all sorts of dimensions, and that fragmentation, I think, is a symptom of a tension between, on the one hand, the need for common standards, common ways of thinking about this market, a common data schema, common contractual conventions, common legal underpinnings. So that common layer of what we might call soft infrastructure needs to be embedded in hard infrastructure, and it's much better deployed if that hard infrastructure is common to the entire market. It also then, I think, facilitates the kind of specialization that we've been discussing, so that other operators can focus on different parts of the market, different layers of the market, and do what they do best in those layers of market, knowing that all of it is based on a common soft infrastructure and a common hard infrastructure. Today, fragmentation is sort of the worst of both worlds, I think, in this market, rather than the best of both worlds. And I think that even though I'm no more visionary than anyone else, and certainly no more visionary than anyone on this panel, I think that is the vision that we have to have in mind when we're shooting for a market that is, as I said, orders of magnitude larger than it is today.
Thank you, Chris. I want to just pick up on a word you used, sort of fragmentation, because I think it is actually something that's a pretty live issue right now. I mean, as I think most observers, many people in the room may know, other crediting programs, large crediting programs, their names escape me right now, I don't know why, have chosen to go with S&P or ICE Green Trace. Of course, the UNFCCC has chosen to go with Trovio. And then governments around the world are making their own decisions. Is this fragmentation, is it a bug? Is it a feature? Is it irrelevant? Because there's something, a substrate, one ring to rule them all below that? Like, what's the end game here? Or is this just competition at this point?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I think fragmentation, just the word itself, sometimes has a negative connotation, but I think there's options that exist, quite frankly. There's competition, and I think it drives all of us on this panel to make sure that we're innovating our solutions and we're moving in the way that the market really needs, right? I think more importantly, and Chris, you alluded to this, I think it's okay for options to exist, but those options need to speak the same language. So having common data standards, and I think everyone on this panel has contributed to the work that CDOP has done, the Carbon Data Open Protocol. There's a number of other kind of harmonization activities that are happening across the market, like Cat Trust, for example, or the work that the G20 Working Group is doing as well. So I think fragmentation is a symptom of options, and I think that makes sense. There's also, as countries sort of embark on their own journeys, There might be jurisdictions that opt to create their own registry infrastructure, right, and something that they want to manage in-house. And at that point, it's not one of those things that I would say is fragmentation. But as you're building this system, you just have to you have to keep the door open for connectivity, right? And that's connectivity for exchanges, for liquidity. That's connectivity to banks to provide settlement. All of these things that maybe are not as common now in the market that we know of, but I think in the next 5 to 10 years are going to be commonplace, to be frank.
So the way I see it, I think, is that program diversity, thank you, program diversity is inevitable, and it's also healthy. So as different policy objectives or new market mechanisms come to bear, they're going to spur on innovations and new programs and other registry providers. So, it's a signal that we're in an effective and scaling market. And as we talk about scaling, fragmentation, that word comes up a lot. Fragmentation in the sense of competitive registries or competitive registry providers, is not, I don't think it ever will be the problem. I think the problem is isolation. So it's where registry infrastructure or registry providers fail to or refuse to connect, right? Not the existence of competitive registries. And I guess if we kind of explore that point a little bit further and break it down, what are some of the hurdles then that would kind of prevent or block a registry from connecting? And I think it's this myth around interoperability having to be uniform and really rigid. Registries need to focus on their core functions and provide intentional connections. Can you exchange information with them? Can you get data in and out of them? But a real-life example where interoperability doesn't demand sort of this rigorous adherence to uniformity is actually Expansive Connect. It integrates with well over 15 registries today, and each one of them have a different interface, but connect, through automation. So you don't need uniformity to have interoperability. And then I think finally, and this is kind of like an ongoing theme, I think, in a lot of my responses today, but my fourth point here would really be that layered architecture enables scale. So whether it's sort of registry-to-registry connectivity, or if it's an API connectivity into an exchange or a reporting platform or a custodian, the market shouldn't be forced into these impractical, unrealistic approaches like having a single global registry. Likewise, the market shouldn't be forced into adhering to the lowest common denominator standard, right? It stifles innovation. So those are things to think about when you're designing your ecosystem.
Yeah, that was great, and I totally agree. And I don't want to be redundant, but just generally agree with these concepts of connectivity and through APIs. But I'll just give an example of sort of like an adjacent environmental market, which is the energy attribute certificate market. So take, for example, or renewable energy credits, that's sort of more commonly how they're known in the US. But guarantees of origin, for example, in Europe, every country selects a registry to issue these certificates on, and they're all connected through an association of issuing bodies, which allows, in most cases, instant transfer between the different registries, of which I think there are over a dozen. And so it works very well and supports a strong market. And then you can compare it to the renewable energy credit markets in the US, where you have different registries from different registry providers that are mostly regional based. There's no sort of centralized association. It's up to the registries themselves to connect and allow for transfer. But again, that works. So I think it's important from a technology provider perspective to not take a prescriptive view, because there's ultimately, we see in other spaces that fragmentation isn't an issue.
So I think I'll contribute as the most recent entrant into the carbon markets by asking a question of the panelists and of the rest of you. It sounds as if all of the technology is available to effectively create an interoperable market so that even if there's nominal fragmentation, different names providing different services to different providers, there is the functional equivalent of a unified, consolidated market. And yet, we have anything but a unified, consolidated market today in the carbon markets. I don't think I understand the nature of the problem well enough to know exactly why that is the case, but I do suspect that that part of the reason is that even though there is the technical capacity for the interoperability, that potential is not being realized. Something is getting in the way. And that something that's getting in the way is creating transactions costs, frictions in this market that this market can barely handle. It's hard enough for project developers, for example, to raise the capital they need, spend the time they need to get their projects validated, verified, and then come to market. If we add on additional transaction costs, who knows how many projects that might have otherwise been operating are not. Who knows how many other buyers who might have been operating in this market actively are not, because it's too confusing. So it's a question. It sounds like a rhetorical question. It's not really meant as a rhetorical question, but it is something that I think I and perhaps others would like to better understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Chris. And I know that at least some of us in the room and all of us on the panel, this is our day-to-day, so we're very entrenched in these conversations. But I think these building blocks have not been around for that long. I think the work around harmonization of data and having common data standards is recent. And now we're seeing, as the convergence between countries and voluntary markets as well, trying to figure out at what point does a project register within the country's registry? Is it pre-registration from the voluntary standard, or is it after? And I think some of those questions are still being answered now. So I would say we have the tools to now make sure that, one, that we're speaking the same language and we can connect the systems. The workflows still need to be defined a little bit to get from this idea of, okay, we can do it, it's possible, but how will it exactly be done? So I would really say that 2025, the best way to summarize it is the year that we sort of all came together, and you saw Seed Up and Cat Trust and all of us, different initiatives, all of us and more, be part of these working groups to really make sure that we can get there. And now 2026 and beyond is going to be the year that we actually make those connections. So, yeah.
So my perspective on this is a little bit different from the rest of the panel. I think it's because of the history that Expansive has in the marketplace. And so one of this is getting the facts out, right, and getting the data out there. Because I hear all of your points, and I think they're really good ones to go through and address if we had the time one by one. But ultimately, I think that a lot of the places that we're focusing aren't on the next generation of technology or even policy advancement. It's on things that have already been solved, right? So when I think about transactions, again, just to pick on Expansive Connect, since it's not an issuing registry, it's pushing around 1 billion assets in transfers each year, right? So, obviously there is some level of liquidity, fungibility going on in the market for project developers and connecting them to buyers. If I think about North America Recs, Expansive actually operates probably 9 out of 10 of the registries in North America, and we have fungibility. We allow transfers between registries as well as transferring if you wanted to on Expansive Connect again. So it's to point out that I think where I'd like to see us focus is on things like digital MRV. Right, that's something that could really advance the market, really grow the full marketplace, and increase market trust tenfold. And when I look at digital MRV, it benefits from rapid iteration and experimentation. And by contrast, registries are system of records, right? They're intended to be conservative and durable. And so keeping those layers separate, keeping those policies, separate but obviously connected, will allow the success of both while, keeping market trust in place. So, it's places like that, digital MRV, advanced analytics, that I think we should be talking about and figuring out how to build around the real foundational layer of registries.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was sort of a rich discussion, something worth sort of digging into with panelists maybe in the hallways afterwards as well. But I would like to switch gears somewhat and just sort of, very, very topically, and I think this was yesterday, you hear threats from the Iranian government against data centers and so on and so forth. And when I was a younger person, I worked at the UNFCCC, and first couple of weeks on the job, I was not on the infrastructure side of things. I was on policy and strategy and for markets. But I sort of approached the technology folks, the infrastructure folks, and I innocently asked, where are the servers? And the response I get, aside from sort of, you don't need to know this, and you probably shouldn't know this, the response I got was, well, they can't all be wiped out by the same nuclear bomb. And that was what I was told. So I got to ask the question, given everything that's going on about data, security, infrastructure resilience, and so forth, I appreciate that there's limits on what you can share, but what can you say about this and its priority that you place as an organization on these matters?
Thank you. For ICE, security is core to what we do, and ICE Green Trace specifically is actually built on the same security and governance framework as our global clearinghouses and ICE Clear Credit. So our global clearinghouses manage billions of dollars in collateral every day, and ICE Clear Credit is one of 8 institutions designated by the federal government to be systemically important to the U.S. financial system. So we have sort of an enormous amount of regulatory oversight, and we take it very seriously. And ICE Green Trace is built on that same InfoSec paradigm. And so that includes, like Robin, actually what you were saying, we have like-for-like disaster recovery data centers on different continents throughout the world. We commission regular third-party penetration testing. We also just go through continuous testing and publish third-party audit reports along with this InfoSec stature on the ICE Trust Center, which is publicly available online. And we do that because, I touched on this in sort of my first point, but for us it's super important for institutional investors to be able to trust the infrastructure of the markets that they're investing money in. It's important for capital to flow. And ultimately, being a registry provider is a custodial role, and custodianship is sort of inherent to what ICE was built to do.
Go ahead.
Sorry for the temporary pause here. I think it's a great question that you posed to the panel, again, Robin. I think even outside the war that's going on, registries should always be treated as financial grade applications. Registries are responsible for instruments that have real legal and financial consequence. Registries create these instruments that then underpin contracts, settlement, compliance obligations. So where you have just your run-of-the-mill errors or intentional manipulation, it results in real financial loss, regulatory non-compliance, and then double counting disputes. And so it's a must that your infrastructure provider follows the same rigors in terms of infrastructure as capital markets. And so echoing a lot of the same things that Will just mentioned, it requires independently audited controls, so, certifications like SOC 2, also just general certifications on how you're looking at your architecture, like NIST. It also requires that you have strong governance around who can access your data, so mechanisms like role-based access is important in your infrastructure. And then for all of the reasons already named, you should be resilient to cybersecurity attacks, right? You should have backup and disaster recovery in multiple locations. And you need to be proactive. And I would stress this point, that being proactive is probably the best measure that you could do in your security. So having penetration tests running frequently and fixing those vulnerabilities, again, just makes your infrastructure that much stronger and ensures there's data confidentiality and continuity.
Needless to say, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that it's an interesting question, though, for another reason, and that is that it presupposes that we have a very clear understanding of the nature of the asset and the nature of the information that's being protected and secured. And one of the sort of enlightening, and not in a good way, realizations that I've come to over the last couple of years is that the very legal nature of this intangible asset we call a carbon credit is open for debate. It's up for it's subject to a great deal of fraught debate over its very nature, and by extension, then the way in which, for example, it should get reconstructed if it is corrupted in any way, whether it's something as horrible as a bomb, or something as run-of-the-mill as a corrupted file. And there are a whole bunch of jurisdictional issues that apply to that as well. In many and most other markets that we know, in the securities markets, for example, these are questions that were asked and answered decades ago. And so we forget that they are relevant questions, but they're present questions in this market today. So I think that that's perhaps a level beneath the level at which you are asking, but we have to think about that as well.
Yeah, and I'll keep it short. I think the rest of the panel really touched on that, but I think we all understand the importance of the infrastructure at hand, and which is why our organizations, I think, are no stranger to the financial markets, right? So we talk about connectivity, and Katie, you mentioned it's about being proactive. So as you open up your system, you also have to be able to monitor potential abuse, right? So we understand sort of the severity of the infrastructure at hand. And then, Chris, to your point, as we get into questions of legal title and collateral, that becomes even more important. So I would say the organizations up here are a representation of the foundations that existed for years and decades on financial markets, and translating those into a market that we see that's growing year over year.
Yeah, and I think that's very, very helpful, and thank you for sharing what you can. And of course, I think it was you, Chris, who talked a little bit, and as others did, about the legal nature. For those, this sort of reminds me of the register versus registry debate as to what is actually being run by the programs and so forth. And also, I think it's UNIDROIT, the UN's legal division, is currently at a fairly advanced stage of trying to sort of come up with a characterization of what a carbon credit is, and that might have some significant implications for all of us, while governments around the world, I think, are also trying to elaborate their definitions of digital assets and so forth. So it's sort of a very fast-moving space, which is exciting, but also a little nerve-wracking. I am aware of the sort of the time, and just want to grant the audience a chance to sort of ask any questions that people may have at this point. While you're thinking about questions, I do have one other question for the panel. I think it's fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, all of you sort of have a more conventional approach to registries. We hear a lot about blockchain and DLT and what is that? What role, if any, does it have in what the future of registries are?
Yeah.
It's pouncing on that one.
No, I mean, it has a valuable role. I mean, not S&P, but other registry partners and folks that we work with, JP Morgan, for example, S&P has signed an MOU with, have built their systems with blockchain and distributed ledger technology at the forefront. I will say, though, that if you have an append-only sort of registry and you have your robust audit trail in place, I think that can serve the purpose of a registry just as good without necessarily the overhead or the over-engineering of the solution. And this is a concept that we get into a lot with folks that are, like I said, just starting on their registry journey, whether it's a standard or whether it's a jurisdiction. So it can certainly get the job done. Now, we do believe there's a place for blockchain and distributed ledger technology as we get into this conversation of settlement, right, and working with banks and working with our partners as well. But I don't want to lose the forest for the trees. I think without that solution, you can still have a registry that works, right?
Yeah, so I think I'd echo a lot of that. Like, short story, Ice Green Trace does not run on blockchain. I think ultimately it's ICE's job to assess the requirements of our customers and the requirements of the market, and then our technologists will build to those requirements. And as of yet, they haven't seen a need for blockchain technology. But I would like to note that ICE has long been always been at the forefront of both blockchain and crypto. We founded Backed, which was the first federally regulated marketplace and custodian for Bitcoin and other crypto futures. And sort of a cool side note is we have a secret cold wallet somewhere to store those. We are in the process of investing $2 billion into Polymarket, which runs on blockchain. We are early investors in Coinbase and T0. And currently, we're seeking regulatory approval for the tokenization of securities on the New York Stock Exchange, which will allow 24/7 trading and instant settlement. But even with all that background, it sort of was a call that this didn't need to be based on blockchain. We do have the view that absolutely it can be integrated, sort of like what Arslan was saying, but there's no need for it today.
I guess I'm with the pack on this one. Even though I do see the promise of blockchain, especially for atomic settlement, having once been a trader in conventional markets and having to size up the risk that accumulates when it's just T+1, if not to say T+3 or T+5 settlement, I can genuinely see the value of that. But I do think that if you look around at various jurisdictions, including the U.S., the debate among regulators and legislators over how to conceive of legally and regulate tokenized assets, you have to acknowledge that there are so many unsettled questions that I think it would be a mistake for us to take that on in the carbon market, in addition to all of the other unsettled questions we have. Just for example, tokens that exist on a distributed ledger exist more or less everywhere at once. In other words, they're not easily anchored to any one jurisdiction. While we're debating the legal nature of carbon credits, why complicate matters if it's hard to actually anchor a credit to a single jurisdiction? And so, again, I think it's a very valuable solution to a set of problems that we haven't yet confronted here.
And just to close it out, I also agree with the panel on all the sentiments expressed. I would just say, and maybe this is from more of a technology point of view, but distributed ledger technology is a tool, but it's not a defining requirement. And I think what we need to focus on as the marketplace is really the outcome and less about how it's implemented, right? So, the technology you use doesn't change what the role of registries is and what it's accountable for. And so at the end of the day, whatever your system is built on, as long as it can do those core registry functions really, really well, is what ultimately matters.
Thank you all. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Hey there, Jason Grillo. I'm starting a nonprofit for improving super-pollutant engagement by corporates. So you talked a lot about how the core function of registry is to be a system of record. So building on Robert's previous question on the future of what registry infrastructure might look like, where do you see the role of standards development, methodology development, in light of the, again, core function of registry, which is to be that system of record?
Okay. No, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
So that's also a very interesting question. One way that you can look at it is that we're, our role in the marketplace is to provide the technology that codifies or implements the standard and the policy itself. My personal viewpoint, as I expressed earlier, is that markets function best when there's competition and diversity of methodology and standards. That doesn't mean that those methodologies and standards can be loose and fast, right? They have to have real science-based evidence and have gone through rounds of consultation, right, and sort of auditing to be published. But assuming that they've gone through that, the technology has to meet that need, right? And so I think it's very important that your registry infrastructure be able to flex to that. And again, in my experience, the registry technology has been able to flex to plastic methodologies, renewable methodologies, nuclear, right? The list goes on, clean heat. And so it's really just understanding that policy and then making sure you can codify it. So I don't know if others on the panel have.
Just a quick point on that. And we touched on this before, but I think each kind of entity playing to its strengths, right? So the work that standards do, and for a long time, I feel like registries and standards were kind of used synonymously, but I think we're at the point now where the market understands that at the end of the day, the responsibilities that a standard has is, irreplaceable. Robin, I'm sure you can speak to this, but all the work that goes into the development of a methodology and making sure that the methodology is up to date is different than the work that goes on from a technology and an infrastructure standpoint. Now, one needs to support the other. So, as you get into new markets, like you mentioned, Katie, plastics or Scope 3 or whatever it is, the technology on the registry needs to be able to support that methodology. So there needs to be a lot of work in terms of making sure that these two strengths work in parallel. But I think, the work that the standard does is fundamentally different than the work that the registry and infrastructure provider will do.
Which, in my view, then begs the question: if there are certain layers of this market where the market as a whole would benefit from competition, and there are other layers where the market as a whole would benefit from cooperation, how do we separate those two so that we don't force the cooperative level to be effectively competitive, and vice versa. And I think that's a set of loaded questions in this market that are important to address.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Keeping an eye on the time, I think we've got time just for one more question, Madam. Did you?
Just a really quick question, and it's kind of for Katie, but appreciating what you said about taking traditional infrastructure and applying it to new markets.
Yeah.
We've seen kind of in the carbon credit space, especially with the nature base, that there's some leakage. So how are you thinking about taking that traditional kind of core infrastructure and applying it to the space where you know that there's this like problem?
So, in the interest of time, because I think the description around leakage and where you see the linkage is going to be really important to answering your question. But in the interest of time, just assuming that you're referring to some of the integrity events that have occurred over the past, let's say, couple of years, I would see that as a focus on really measuring, right, and being able to audit some aspects that are outside of both, I would say the program, outside of the program, so that's policy or the methodology, as well as the infrastructure itself. And so it's not to say that we should ignore that by any means, but it is now brought to the attention. So how do we approach solving that as a collective is where I would focus on, right? So, from a technology standpoint, again, not to sound like a broken record, but one of the ways that we can look at strengthening is through digital MRV, right? And so to me, digital MRV really does benefit from being standalone so that it could rapidly, innovate. And we don't want to slow that innovation down. And so, having that sit as a separate entity from the registry, but be able to plug into the registry, I think is really key in order to scale the marketplace and address some of those, I think, integrity issues that you were referring to. Yeah.
Thank you. This takes us to the end of our allotted time. So I just want to sort of offer a few sort of thank yous. Thank you to all of you for attending. I know this has been sort of there's a packed agenda, lots of competition for your attention. Do want to express gratitude that you've chosen to be here and learn from this panel of experts about sort of the latest on registry infrastructure and the full range of, I think, exciting developments. This is one of these panels that I think every year there'll be something quite new and different. It's not same old, and I think one of the most exciting things about this space is just seeing that evolution in real time. And when we look at other markets, whether it's stock exchange, gold exchange, whatever, these are things which sort of we take as sort of like from on high, and here I think there's a real opportunity to sort of design as we go, and I think that's a pretty fascinating thing. And I think on that note, I'd like to applaud all panelists for their roles, because I think they're at the forefront of that exciting design stuff, and I just really want to appreciate all of you. Thank you.